Now, as for Herbert Hoover, historically, we had seen Hoover was a great humanitarian. He had run the Food Administration during World War I. He had waged the campaign for Belgian relief as a private citizen during World War I as well, providing the Belgians with all sorts of food and assistance and aid as their country was shattered by the German invasion in 1914. And so, faced with this crisis, Hoover was unable to deal with it. And in many ways, this had to do with the fact that during his lifetime, and the lifetime of all the people around him, the last significant economic downturn had been 1892. So you're talking the better part of about 40 to 45 years away from, removed from that last economic downturn. Hoover and his entire generation of leaders and thinkers all would have been young men or children at this time. So it wasn't like they were in positions to see what to do about this. You have an entire generation of American and global fiscal and economic thinkers and politicians who have never had to contend with a disaster on this scale before. So as a result, dealing with it becomes very difficult. They try solutions which are based on what they think they already know. Let's let the private sector handle an awful lot of this. Hoover figured on his own that the widening misery of the Depression could be solved by the American individualist free market laissez-faire system curing and correcting itself. He believed the economy was efficient. He believed the U.S. economy was basically stable and sound, and that it remained largely undamaged. And so he would seek to, in some ways, try to aid banks and corporations and hope to trickle that money down through society. But he wasn't going to do much initially beyond that. He said that confidence was the key to revival of the American economy. Over time, it becomes clear confidence is not the answer. But even if he had wanted initially to do significant things to change in 1929 and 1930, Hoover was confronted with a Congress controlled by Republicans, a conservative Congress controlled by Republicans, who, as a body, collectively passionately believed in the things that all the Republicans had believed in from the 1920s on. After all, they'd elected Hoover in 1928, saying the last 10 years of great economic times, they're all due to us. They're all due to our policies. They believed very much in this notion of minimal government intervention. The idea of the state playing an active role in the economy as a manager of finance and a lender of last resort, that whole concept didn't exist yet. That concept is going to be born out of the rubble of what happens now during this time. But into that time, there was no model for which the Republican or Democrat, anyone had a mindset of a template of what should be done. The biggest thing, though, is this next point here. Hoover's an ideologue. He's an idealist. That's probably a more accurate way to put it. He's a true believer. He truly, truly believes in rugged individualism, in self-reliance and self-responsibility. And his great fear is that direct relief would convert America into the dole, would make us into a welfare state. It would destroy rugged individualism. It would destroy the one thing that separated America from all the other nations and that accounted for our entrepreneurial spirit, our success, our advancement, the standards of living, the things we'd arrived at in the world thus far. What Hoover ultimately does, though, is he winds up bending on this because the people are calling for it and more has to be done. He calls international conferences. He places a moratorium on the war debts. The London Economic Conference takes place during this time, which doesn't lead to anything. The United States backs out because our own interests are feared. We fear what's going to happen in our own interests. But we see internationally and nationally Hoover involved in trying to solve the problem. But to the American public, it appears that he's doing too little too late or that he's a do-nothing president. This is part of the mythology now in American history of who Herbert Hoover is or was. For instance, he did do some things. The Federal Farm Board, which was created just before the stock market crash in 1929, had powers that Hoover developed and expanded upon to try to meet the needs of the crisis. The goal was to try to buy up surplus product and crops in the United States to stabilize prices. But it was sort of like pushing back the tide with a broom. The Federal Farm Board was swamped by the amount of crop product that was out there, and it couldn't handle the overproduction of farm goods and digest the amounts that were in play. More significant would be the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Hoover creates in early 1932. This falls in nicely with Hoover's idea of a trickle-down theory. The idea is that you give money to institutions. You give money to insurance companies, banks, loan corporations, building corporations, agricultural organizations, railroads, state and local governments. And what those organizations will do with that money then is they will spend that money on projects and activities and invest that money in ways that will then trickle it down throughout the economy. Hoover also did engage in some public works projects. He did not choose the naming of it, but later on the name Hoover Dam was named for him because the project started under his administration, a federal government improvement project, a public works project to put people to work for the government in some ways. These types of projects are not what you would call direct aid. They're indirect relief. Hoover felt that to give people direct relief would cripple them. If you give people direct relief, Hoover's great fear is you would get them used to this, waiting for more, waiting for more, waiting for more, and it would destroy individual initiative. So as such, then, during this time, you begin to have an awful lot of social unrest in the United States, as could be expected. People are thrashing around for answers and not getting their answers, not getting solutions. So some begin to take direct action on their own, take matters in their own hands. A couple examples of these would be the Farm Holiday Organization. Farmers discovered or concluded that maybe the best thing they could do is try to, on their own, deliberately or forcibly keep crops and product off the market as a way to control prices. This movement collapsed in many ways, but they're trying to reverse the drop by destroying product, preventing product from getting to market, and all the things that would entail with that happening. Your prices could then rise because there'd be fewer amounts of product out there. So they're thrashing about for an answer. The largest, most publicized answer was the Bonus Army March of 1932. What you had is about 18,000 veterans of World War I marched on Washington, D.C. They had a bonus that was supposed to be payable to them that Congress had approved at the end of World War I, a bonus that was payable to them in 1945. They went to Washington and demanded payment of their bonus now. And while this bonus bill was defeated in Congress, the legislation that had been passed to try to do this was defeated. They camped out on the grounds around the Capitol, the National Mall, and all kinds of areas in Washington. Hoover decides that they're a public nuisance and need to be removed. Douglas MacArthur, General of the Army, takes matters in his own hands and decides to purge them, throw them out of the countryside, and thought the country was in danger from communists, and burns them out and drives them out of the National Mall area. Doing so wound up being a huge negative public image black eye for Hoover. It makes Hoover the most hated man in the country. MacArthur in the Army drove him out, but Hoover took the blame. And so with this, then, you have a nation where Hoover is belittled and mocked and reviled as a do-nothing president, which was agonizing for a guy who had been such a great humanitarian and such a fixer and solver his whole life to be in this position where he's seen by his own people as largely impotent and useless. Hoovervilles, the shanty towns sprung up all across the country of people who had been thrown out of their homes, people who had lost their mortgages, and they're living in boxes and shanties, and they were nicknames. These were Hoovervilles. Hoover blankets was a newspaper over you. Hoover hog was an armadillo. Hoover sandwich was bread and ketchup. So they labeled things to Hooverize in the 1920s, meant to make things efficient and make them modern. To Hooverize by the 1930s, or anything with a Hoover in front of it, was a mocking thing about our negative economic growth and the suffering we're all entailing. You have people a large generation of Americans, the so-called hobo class now, the unemployed, who are sort of drifting from place to place across the country, trying to make ends meet. And the time has come with this depression when marriages go down, divorces go down, and childbirths all go down because nobody can afford any of these things. You can't afford to expand your family. You can't afford to get unmarried if you're already married. And you certainly can't afford to get married and start a family if you don't have one now. So all the normal social patterns of life are altered and disrupted by this depression in many ways. Which brings us to 1932, which is seen by most historians as a major wave or shift election. In this election, you see Hoover versus Franklin Roosevelt. And this is the tragedy in many ways for Hoover, is that the man who was seen as the thoroughly capable candidate winds up being, in the views of the American people, a thoroughly incapable president. And the Republicans had to nominate him again. To not do so would be to admit that the past 12 years, the failure of the last 12 years was all their fault. They had to renominate him because otherwise they'd be admitting their policies failed. So what the Republicans promised, their promise was, what the American public translated as a bitter joke, prosperity is just around the corner, just around the corner. And they wanted to reduce public expenditures. They wanted to balance the budget, expand the tariff, maintain the gold standard. They wanted immigration restrictions, and even still to keep prohibition as well, and maybe limit the service pensions for veterans, but try to do something to get them some of their money. But overwhelmingly, it's still a laissez-faire, small government state economy that they're going to be advocating and pushing for. As for the newcomer to this election, the Democrats nominate Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt comes in also calling for, among other things, a balanced budget. He calls Hoover a reckless spender, which is interesting political talk because just wait to see what the next chapter brings. And they do call for repeal the 18th Amendment. They want to do away with prohibition. They do want a sound currency, a lot of platitudes. And basically, Roosevelt didn't have to promise much because people were tired enough of Hoover, and that model, the laissez-faire businessman as hero model, had been so discredited that the Democrats were in an excellent position to win in 1932, no matter what Roosevelt said or didn't say. But he did promise that he was going to, in his acceptance speech, he talked about offering a new deal to the American people. And his later program will then be referenced as the New Deal. And he wins in just as enormous of a landslide as Hoover won in just 4 years earlier. And a new voter coalition shows up in this model. Hoover becomes a bridge to the New Deal because by holding back, even though he did things with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Farm Board and did attempt to engage, and did more and more over time, engage the federal government in the economy, the perception of the American public is Hoover did nothing. Even though it's not true, it's the perception. Sometimes if people think something's true, that's important. By thinking Hoover was doing nothing and was a do-nothing president, that becomes a bridge to the New Deal because it clears the way then to allow Franklin Roosevelt to come in and say, you want me to do things? I'll do things. And it clears the way for the kind of governmental activism that is going to be associated with the New Deal then and ever since. The modern Democratic Party, the coalition that established it, is created out of this election. Up until 1932, African Americans had always voted for Republicans. It was the party of emancipation, it was the party of Lincoln. After 1932, a new voter coalition emerges, a coalition of urban progressives that we'd seen from the earlier chapters and reviews, industrial and manual laborers, immigrants, the depressed rural vote, and African Americans all come together to form the coalition that we know as leading this Democratic landslide of the Democratic Party. For the first time in 1932, you get maybe a class-conscious element in American politics, and that element's probably been with us to some degree ever since. The populists tried to inject it and largely failed in their attempt to inject it in 1896. 1932, we see that, and there were real questions about the direction of the country. What was going to happen to the republic? What was going to happen to this free democracy now that Franklin Roosevelt had arrived and had his claims for a New Deal? What shape was this New Deal going to look like? What was the body of it going to be? And that will be the topic of our very next lesson that we discuss moving forward.